Hey friends, it's Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, it's been several weeks since I've been with you all. I've been extremely busy as usual, been working hard on my forthcoming book, and we've got a lot to catch up on. This episode, I want to take some time to return to the issue of Mount Sinai. Now, at the beginning of this year, I released this book, Mount Sinai in Arabia, and I also released a 9-class DVD series that goes along with the book. The DVD series is really just sort of an expanded version of me talking about everything that's in the book. But what I've done in this is I've gone through all of the primary archaeological, geographic, geologic, historical, traditional, biblical, all of the different reasons why Jebel al-Lawz in Saudi Arabia is absolutely by far the single best candidate for any of the potential Mount Sinai candidates out there. And I knew that this would be a controversial subject because there's really not very much out there that's not controversial. But this has been a very controversial subject. And so what I wanted to do is really just put together a book that simplifies all of the primary arguments so that anyone can really wrap their head around the primary arguments and really make an informed decision themselves. Now, I'm excited about this very much because as I'm recording this in a few weeks, I'm heading back to Saudi Arabia. So I've been mentioning this a lot really over the past year and a half. It's been the issue that the Lord has had me on. It's been the mission, if you will, that the Lord has had me parked on. And not just the issue of Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia, but the book that I'm working on, again, just to give you an update, it's taken me longer than any other book that I've ever worked on. I'm more excited about it probably than any other book that I've written. And it addresses the issue of the return of Jesus. It addresses the larger story of the unfolding of messianic prophecy throughout the scriptures, but how it all culminates, of course, with the coming of the Lord, with the return of the Messiah, the coming of the King. But specifically how the return of Jesus relates to and is founded upon the story of the Exodus. And it's really amazing. I mean, I've talked about it a bit. I've actually just posted a sermon, which is sort of me just touching on this issue on my YouTube channel, so you can watch that as well. If you sort of want the giveaway at the end of the book, if you want to see where it's all going, you can get a pretty good overview by watching that sermon. But the book is much more than that. So in any case, this is just what the Lord's had me parked on. Now, let me just say this. If you have not gotten a copy of this book, go to joelstrumpet.com. That's my website. And of course, when you go there, if you really want to bless the ministry, sign up to be part of the newsletter. If you're watching this, sign up to be part of my YouTube channel, sign up to be part of the newsletter, because you can get updates and information in terms of different things that we're doing. So we've got the book on the store. We've also got the DVD, and I've also got some kind of neat specials where I've created these commemorative coins that have a picture of the split rock of Moses on one side and my ministry logo on the other. This is to commemorate the opening up of Mount Sinai in our day. So we've got a special bundle where you can get the book in the coin or the DVD in the coin, or you can just get the coin on its own and this sort of thing. And so there's some neat, just bundles to make it cheaper. But go to my store and make sure you get yourself a copy. Now, before we jump into today's discussion, I want to mention something, which is to say that we've mentioned this, I think I've mentioned this a little bit, but we also, myself and my good friend Dalton Thomas, He's the director of FAI, Frontier Alliance International. We're actually also going to be doing the first Christian tours ever to Iraqi Kurdistan. We're going to be doing this in 2020 at the end of March. Now, we've mentioned this, but we haven't really opened it up. For more information, go to legacytours.org. This is going to be a super cool trip. Again, up to Kurdistan, northern Iraq. My guess is it will be, because it's the first, it'll be a smaller tour, a bit more of an intimate tour. So myself and Dalton Thomas. And we went earlier this year, Dalton and I and our tour agent, Rhonda, and sort of explored all of the sites, sort of did a preliminary of the tour, and it's going to be super cool. So what are we going to do? What are we going to talk about this week? This week, we are going to talk about the location of Mount Sinai, the real Mount Sinai. And what we're going to do is look at several of the different candidates, and we're going to weigh each candidate. I just thought this would be kind of a neat little exercise just to sort of refresh our memory. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about where is the real Mount Sinai. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, again, several candidates, and then we're going to weigh each candidate against various geographic hints and indicators within the Scriptures. And by no means is this a comprehensive analysis of this. That would take literally months. I mean, it's a very complicated issue to work through all of these little landmarks and names and locations, and there's times that it seems contradictory, and you go back and forth and this sort of thing. But we're going to look at some of the primary, some of the important geographic hints that are within Scripture, and then there's these criteria, these geographic criteria, and then we're going to say, what about this mountain? Does that fulfill? Could that be the real Mount Sinai? And so it's kind of a neat exercise. So, first of all, some argue, let's look at some of the different candidates. Some argue that the real Mount Sinai could be in the land of Edom. Now, when I say this, there's some discrepancy in terms of where Edom is. And most recently, my friend Dr. Michael Heiser has been arguing for this, that the real Mount Sinai, he won't say which mountain he thinks it is, but it's somewhere in the land of Edom. Now, if you look at his maps, he has Edom as a very small area. So I've got a map here that kind of gives you an idea of what he means by Edom. Now, I would argue that when we look at, for instance, Ezekiel 25, which admittedly was sometime later after the Exodus, but Edom was defined as being from Teman in the north to Dedan in the south. So Dedan is a few hundred miles into Saudi Arabia, which means it's probably several times. Edom, by the time of Ezekiel, as well as Jeremiah, has a very similar reference, limiting Edom from Teman to Dedan. It was several times larger than this sort of limited region of Edom. And other than that, some of it is just speculation. I mean, we know it was south of Moab, but we don't know how far south it went during the time of the Exodus. But we do know that during Ezekiel's day, it was much, much larger than this. But for the sake of argument, we're just going to stick with, for instance, and you'll see this in a lot of Bible atlases and so forth. It's kind of just an assumption. Again, we don't know, but we're going to work from this assumption. So that's one candidate. Again, just vaguely there, somewhere in the land of Edom. Menashe Harel, he's an Israeli archaeologist. He argues for a mountain called Jebel Sin Bishar. So that is over there on the western side of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, interestingly enough, Gordon Franz has been far and away the single most vocal critic of Jebel al-Lawz as the real Mount Sinai. This is also the mountain that he chooses and champions and he thinks is the real Mount Sinai. So he's taken the position of Menashe Harel. As we'll see, this mountain is completely untenable. It just does not work with the biblical record. You would have to reject the Bible as the Word of God if you wanted to accept this as the real Mount Sinai, as we'll see. Another candidate, Emanuele Annati, he's an Italian archaeologist up there in years. He argues for Har-Karkum, which is in Israel. It's actually in Israel today. It's in the Negev, down there in the southern Negev desert. And a good friend of mine is actually working on her PhD, and this is her thesis. She believes that it's Har-Karkum as well. I sympathize, I think, with a lot of her arguments and so forth, but I feel like it also has a lot of problems. And again, Emanuele Annati is just, convinced. Now, again, we're not dealing with archaeology in this. We're just simply dealing with geography. So that's another candidate. And you can see that's there, north of Eilat, down there in the southern Israeli Negev. James K. Hoffmeyer and David Rohl. James K. Hoffmeyer, a true Egyptologist. David Rohl, kind of a renegade scholar. They both hold to the traditional site. So the traditional site is down there. This is Jebel Musa, as it will often be called, down there in the southern, the pizza-shaped peninsula in between Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. Interestingly enough, this mountain has a tradition that goes back to about the 4th century when the Egyptian monks, the Egyptian Christian monks, were going out there into the desert. And when you go back and you go, well, when did this idea come along? It was not until the 4th century that you find these monks pointing to this particular mountain as the real Mount Sinai. And then in the 5th century, Emperor Justinian built St. Catherine's Monastery down there, which exists. It stands to this day. But it was essentially a fortress to protect the monks who kept getting killed by some of the local Bedouin or the Saracens, or whatever you want to call them. These were these pre-Islamic local Arabs down there in the desert that kept killing the monks. And so Justinian built the fortress, built the monastery, which has come to it was from that time forward, because you go, well, why is this the traditional site? Because you had the Roman Empire stamp of approval from that time forward. And so that's the traditional site. And then, of course, others argue for Jebel al-Lawz, or Jebel al-Luz, which means the mountain of almonds in Arabic. And here it is down there in Saudi Arabia, northwest Saudi Arabia. Where I place this triangle here, it's actually a little bit south of that. I guess I just didn't want to put it right on top of where I had already embedded Midian. But it's down there to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, to the east of the Red Sea. So these are the primary candidates that we're going to look at. And now we're going to weigh each of these candidates against the biblical criteria. So first of all, number one, the real Mount Sinai has to be outside of the Promised Land, right? Because Israel came up out of Egypt, and they were wandering around in the desert for 40 years. And the Lord was very clear that Moses would never enter the Promised Land. So you can't say that Mount Sinai was in the Promised Land and then say they were wandering around the mountain and say that Moses never entered the Promised Land, right? If it's in the Promised Land, this becomes a big, big problem. Now, the question is, what is the Promised Land? We're not talking modern-day Israel, the state of Israel. We're saying, what is the biblical definitions of the Promised Land? Well, first of all, Exodus 23, verse 31, has a pretty clear statement. It's a very general statement. It says, I will set your borders from the Red Sea, okay, that's the Gulf of Aqaba, to the Sea of the Philistines. What's the Sea of the Philistines? That's the Mediterranean. So from Eilat, modern-day Eilat, up to the Sea of the Philistines, and then vaguely from the desert, that's the desert in the south, up to the Euphrates in the north. So now we're talking up, including much of modern-day Lebanon and even parts of Syria. Now, what people do, sometimes they look at this and they say, well, the entire Euphrates, they follow it all the way over to Iraq. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that in the north, the Euphrates in the north is sort of the northernmost extent of the Promised Land, down to the desert, which is fairly vague, from Eilat, the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, up to the Sea of the Philistines. Now, you have several other places in the Scriptures which help us to understand Together, when we look at these all together, the biblical definition of the boundaries of the Promised Land. First of all, Genesis 15. This is the Abrahamic covenant when the Lord said, Abraham, I'm going to give you this land, and it's the land of the Hivites. He goes through all of the ites, the Kenites, the Girgashites. You're going to have all of their land, but he defines it largely tribally, and so it's difficult to know exactly where these people were all located. Elsewhere, you have Numbers 34, 3 through 5. You have Joshua 15, 1 through 4. Then you have Ezekiel 47 and 48. Now, Ezekiel 47 and 48 is really millennial. But, the question is there a difference in the millennium between the boundaries of the Promised Land versus premillennial? And I would argue that really you can put these all together. And so we're not going to go through each one in great detail. Again, that would be an entire program. But what a few of them mention is Wadi el-Arish, or the river of Egypt, or the brook of Egypt. And so this is a wadi, or a brook, that if you go south of the Gaza or southwest of the Gaza, you're moving over toward Port Said in Egypt, you get to this wadi. And some people say the brook of Egypt or the river of Egypt would have actually been the easternmost branch of the Nile. So they move it all the way over right up to the border of Egypt. A lot of other scholars say it's Wadi al-Arish. Let's just say, I lean toward Wadi al-Arish, so let's just say that's the case. Well, here's a map. Loosely, the lines may not have been perfectly straight, because when you read some of the definitions, it will say up here and then over to here, and so it may kind of jut and move, and we can't be exactly sure. But basically, this is what we're looking at. We're looking at from the Dead Sea down to the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then from the Gulf of Aqaba, again, Eilat, up to Wadi al-Arish. And you can follow Wadi al-Arish, again, like a river, like a dry wadi, up there through the desert, up to the Sea of the Philistines, again, the Mediterranean. So this is basically the southernmost boundaries, again, according to Exodus 23, of the Promised Land. Okay, so with this in mind, let's look at the various candidates and say which one works, which one doesn't. So first of all, if it's within the land of Edom, Dr. Heiser's theory, does that work? Well, yes, that works. It's outside of the Promised Land, so we give that a red check mark. And then Jebel Sin Bashar, Menashe Har-El, Gordon Franz's theory, yes, that's most certainly outside of the Promised Land, even if the Promised Land extended all the way over there to Port Said. That would work. We give it a red check mark. What about Har Karkum? This is a big problem, in my opinion, for Har Karkum. If Exodus 23 is defining the Promised Land, which it says, I will set your boundaries, then there's a problem for Har Karkum because it's clearly within, and it's within even the modern state of Israel, which doesn't go all the way over to Wadi al-Arish. It's clearly within the Promised Land, which means if that's Mount Sinai, then Moses entered the Promised Land. Scriptures are contradictory, and that becomes a huge problem. Now, in talking to my friend, Deb, who's working on her PhD on this, she suggested that Exodus 23 is really just sort of a generalized greater Israel, but it's not really giving us the boundaries of the Promised Land. She would emphasize some of these other passages. The problem is then you're dealing with names and locations which are not necessarily clear. On the other hand, the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea, it is clear. We know exactly where that is. There's no debate. And so I would argue that this is probably a pretty big problem for Har Karkum as the real Mount Sinai. So unfortunately, we give Har Karkum a big X on this particular criterion. What about the traditional site? Well, yes, the traditional site, Jebel Musa, is well outside of the Promised Land, so we give it a red check mark. And then finally, Jebel al-Lawz, again, like the traditional site, like Jebel Sin Bashar, like Edom, outside of the Promised Land, so it gets a red check mark. Number two is Mount Sinai is said to be a 40-day journey from Beersheba. You can say it any number of different ways, because we read in Scripture that Elijah went in the food that he had eaten, in the strength of the food that he had eaten, 40 days, to Mount Sinai. So it seems to indicate that he went on a 40-day journey in the strength of that food that he didn't eat for 40 days. And in the strength of that, he went to Mount Sinai. Okay, so with that said, we know where Beersheba is. Here's a map. We've put a green dot for Beersheba. If it's Edom, then the problem here is that to get to Edom, within the boundaries of Edom, again, as defined by Dr. Heiser and again, a lot of Bible atlases, whether it's the westernmost extent of Edom or the furthest most eastern extent, you're dealing with roughly 50 to 110 miles, in that range, which means that Elijah was traveling a little bit over a mile, 1.3 miles a day, up to a little bit less than 3 miles a day. That's not a 40-day journey. That moving a mile or a little over a mile a day is not much of he's fleeing for his life from Jezebel and Ahab. So I always just say this, look, I'm incredibly out of shape right now, but, I can get up in the morning sometimes before the kids go to school, and I can run 10 miles, or I shouldn't say run, I can trot 10 miles, and I can do that in less than 2 hours. And I'm not a fast runner. I'm an extremely slow runner. So, that's like 12, 13-minute miles. When you look at people running marathons and they go 20, whatever it is, 6 miles or 23 miles, or I'm not even sure what a marathon is. Some of them are running like 7, 8 mile minutes. On average, you got to get pretty low just to qualify for the Boston Marathon. So they're running in sometimes 2 hours. They're running 20, again, I should know what a marathon is, 20 some odd miles in 2 hours. So they're killing it. I'm going super slow. I can do 10 miles, let's say, in a couple hours. And again, I'm a slow runner. I run sometimes barefoot, sometimes with very, very minimalist running shoes, which means I take very short strides. I'm not just out there hitting it. The idea is that in ancient times, even out there in the desert, people could easily travel. You're talking with heavy stuff. They could easily travel 9 miles a day. That's very reasonable. You have examples in ancient history where armies carrying heavy things are going like 15 miles a day. You can calculate how long it took Ezra to go from Babylon all the way back to Israel. And, it's somewhere between 10 miles to 15 miles. You could even go as much as, if you're really moving or fleeing for your life, 20 miles a day. The point is this. On this particular criterion, a 40-day journey from Beersheba, Edom really has to get an X. It's way too close. It's virtually right next to Beersheba. So we give that Edom candidate an X. Then you have Jebel Sin Bishar. That's about 200 miles. It's about 200 miles from Beersheba. So that's about 5 miles a day. That's reasonable. We give it a check. It's certainly, quite possible. Again, Har Karkum, that's about 95 miles or so. That's about 2.5 miles a day, 2.4 miles per day. Again, similar to the Edom theory, it's just too close. It just, as you read it. Now, here's what you could argue. You could say that Elijah went in the strength of that food, and he was there within a couple days at Mount Sinai, and then he just fasted there for 40 days at Mount Sinai. You could argue that. The text doesn't seem to read that way. It seems to say that it took him 40 days to get there. Again, I'm not dogmatic on this, but if we read it that way, then you can allow, it could be 2 miles away, and you could just say he just walked right up the street to Mount Sinai and fasted for 40 days. But the text seems to indicate that he fled for 40 days. So again, if that is what the text says, then in this case, we give Har Karkum, we give it an X. The traditional site is roughly 300 miles away from Beersheba. That's about 7.5 miles a day. Certainly reasonable. That's actually quite reasonable, working your way down there through the harsh desert. We give the traditional site a check. And then, of course, Jebel Allah is about 280 miles, relatively similar to the traditional site from Beersheba. That's about 7 miles a day. Again, we give it a check. Number 3 is that the real Mount Sinai has to be just outside the district of Midian. It's on the far side, on the other side of the desert, outside of Midian. Now, we have to determine where is Midian. Well, first of all, I'm just going to touch on this because it's pretty interesting. Again, in the Bible, Isaiah 60, verses 6 through 7, it's talking about the restoration of the Messianic kingdom. It's talking about the kingdom of the Messiah. And during that time, it says, a multitude of camels will cover you. That's the land of Israel. It says, the young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. They will bring gold and frankincense. They will bear the good news of the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar will be gathered together to you. The rams of Nebaioth will minister to you. They will go up with acceptance on my altar, and I will glorify my glorious house. So the language here is you have the kingdom of Israel being restored. The Messiah is on the ground. His glory has risen upon Israel. And you have this multitude coming up from the region of Midian and Ephah, Sheba, Kedar, Nebaioth, and they are specifically bringing gold and frankincense. Now, why is all this interesting? They're bringing gifts. They're bringing gifts to rebuild and glorify the house of God in Jerusalem. It's an amazing passage. It's an amazing passage. But the names Midian, Ephah, Sheba, Kedar, and Nebaioth, these are all names which together are pointing to the Arabian Peninsula. And then specifically, gold and frankincense are the treasures of the Arabian Peninsula. Now, yes, you could argue that these extend up into southern Jordan. You could most certainly do that. But really the emphasis of these regions would be specifically modern-day Saudi Arabia, all the way down even to Yemen. Sheba, for instance, is often equated with the Queen of Sheba over in Africa, and then she would have crossed over into the southern tip of Arabia. So whether it be the Kush, the people of Kush, they're in Africa, but they also extend over to modern-day Yemen. And the same is with regard to Sheba. So when you have all of these names, Midian, Ephah, Sheba, Kedar, Nebaioth, and they're bringing gold, this is pointing to Saudi Arabia. And so Midian is again, from a biblical perspective, is sort of placed down there. It's most certainly on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. It's not, for instance, you can't move Midian into the Sinai Peninsula. You can't do that biblically, at least. That would be to majorly make an effort to shoehorn the data, to try to manipulate the data, to try to make it fit with your particular theory. Midian is, in all likelihood, even from just a biblical perspective, east of the Gulf of Aqaba, most likely there in Saudi Arabia. Then, interestingly enough, we have this map. And this is a map that was created based on the information put together by a Roman geographer from the first century into the 2nd century. His name was Claudius Ptolemy. A very important figure because he literally, if you go through his geography, he essentially creates these longitude, latitude, a map. He grids out the earth. He has sort of his own numbers and figures. And he creates a map of mountains and rivers and cities and all kinds of things of the ancient world. And so when people have created maps of the world based on his geography, and here's such an example, he places 2 cities. He has Modian and Madium. Again, the A added with the Latinization of whoever created this map, but essentially had Madium and Modian, and these were 2 cities. He has these as 2 cities, and they were on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, as you look there, he has his Sinai Peninsula is much smaller than it is in reality, but he has it over there on the eastern side of the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba. Why are these 2 names, Madium and Modian, interesting? Why are they important? Well, because in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, whenever you come to the name Midian, the Septuagint always has one of 2 variations, either Madian or Madium. So when was the Septuagint translated? Well, they started working on it in 250 BC. So you're talking the 3rd century BC, 250 years before Jesus. So yes, this would be 1,200 years roughly, depending on when you place the Exodus, after the Exodus, but a couple hundred years before Jesus. Jewish tradition held that Midian was actually 2 different cities. And they had two different names for these two cities, Madian and Madium, right? And so it's interesting that Claudius Ptolemy, this Roman secular geographer, aligns with what was obviously the common view of the whole Second Temple period, of this couple hundred years, few hundred years, both before and after Jesus and the apostles. So then we're going to look at a map. Now this is a Google, we're zooming in on the area east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and I've got a green diamond there, and it says Sinai. That's Jebel al-Lawz. And then I have a big blue dot, and it says Al-Bad. Then to the about 20 miles to the west is another blue dot, and it says Magna. These are two modern-day Saudi Arabian cities. You have Al-Bad and Magna, again, 20 miles apart. Al-Bad was on the ancient Arabic or the ancient Arab caravan route. Okay, so the Arabs, the traders, the caravans would come up from the south again with the incense, the frankincense, the gold. They're making their way north up to Syria, or they would cut it over to Egypt. And right on this major ancient road was an oasis. Both Al-Bad and Magna are both oases, or oasi, however you say it. So these are like, when you're there in the area, these are the only two natural places where people would have settled. The rest of it is largely desolate. There are some much, much smaller oases, singular oasis. There's some other, I need to look this up because every time I teach, I still never know the best way to say it. A singular would be oasi, it seems like. It just doesn't feel right. In any case, there are some very small ones. But you have these two very significant oasis towns. One was right on the major Arab caravan route. The other one is right on the coast. These are the two most natural places where people would have settled. Like, if you just, from a geographic or a geologic survey of the whole area, you would go, where would have ancient peoples settled? In these two cities. So it's so fascinating that the area, there's scholarly consensus says this is the region of Midian, but it's fascinating that the place that scholarly consensus places Midian has two towns, and then you have this variation in the Septuagint. You have Madian and Madium, and then you see it again in the writings of Claudius Ptolemy. The point is this. These two towns, these two oasis towns, would it's very, very likely and very reasonable that these were the places that during Jesus' day were understood to be Midian, Madian and Madium. This was the place that Moses had fled. Okay, so with that said, let's look at a couple quotes. Philo was a Jew. He had been influenced by Hellenistic philosophy, Greek philosophy. He was living over there in Alexandria. He was also an Old Testament commentator and philosopher. And he specifies, now again, Philo lived roughly the same time as Jesus, a little bit maybe just before Jesus. He specifies that Mount Sinai, and this is a very important historical witness, he specifies that Mount Sinai is the loftiest, i.e. the tallest and the most sacred mountain in the district of Midian. So you can look up that larger quotation. Now again, Midian, where did they believe Midian was? Over there on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. So what is the tallest mountain in the district, again, according to Philo, of Midian? So that's one testimony. Then also you have Josephus. Josephus, again, a Jerusalemite. He's not over there in Egypt and Alexandria. He's actually there in the land in Jerusalem. He's a historian. We all know Josephus, Flavius Josephus. He recorded the fall of Jerusalem, etc. And he says this. He says, now Moses, when he obtained the favor of Jethro, who's Jethro? That was his father-in-law. Moses married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter. And so after he had obtained the favor of Jethro, he stayed there, where? In Midian. That's where Jethro lived, and he fed Jethro's flock. But sometime afterward, taking his station at the mountain called Sinai, he drove his flocks there to feed them. This is the highest of all the mountains thereabout. So Josephus and Philo, two witnesses from the first century. So what did Jews believe in Jesus' day? What did the Jews believe in the apostles' day? they believed that Mount Sinai was the tallest mountain. Again, it's interesting because you could have this Jerusalem tradition and then also this Alexandrian Jewish tradition. So it's effective that you have two different parts of the world. Jews from two different parts of the region both believed and testified to the same thing. This is, by the way, 300 years, well, you could say 250 years before this tradition pops up concerning the traditional Mount Sinai. So, and if you want to take it all the way back to, again, the early period where the Septuagint was being translated, you have a tradition which begins 600 years before the traditional traditions begin with regard to, before these traditions start with regard to the traditional site of Mount Sinai down there, Jebel Musa, 600 years older. That's significant. You hardly ever hear anybody. Those who sort of mock or belittle Jebel Allah as a legitimate candidate, they never mention that it's the only mountain. It's the only mountain that has this ancient Jewish tradition attached to it. And that by far makes it by far the single best candidate, apart from any other reasons whatsoever. Jebel Allah has the best ancient traditional support. Now, here's Exodus 3:1, okay, not looking at Josephus, but looking at the biblical record. It says, Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness. Now, some translations will say the west side, but western in this context is an idiom for the far side. Again, because the sun rises in front of you and it sets behind you. So oftentimes when it says the western side, it means the far side, the other side of the desert. And he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So here's the biblical testimony. The point is that when Moses left Midian, he went to the other side of the desert, to the far side of the desert, and then he arrived at Mount Sinai. Now, obviously, he didn't go west into the Dead Sea, right? He went to the far side of the desert. So now here's the question. Here's the point. Is that Josephus and Philo and the Bible say that Mount Sinai is somewhere outside of, on the other side of the district. It's within striking distance, the distance that you would lead sheep, a flock of sheep to go feed them outside of Midian. And we have a reasonably good understanding of where Midian is. So with all of this said, let's look at the different candidates. Okay, Edom. If Moses was down there in Midian, and this is, I think this is pretty big. And he was bringing his sheep all the way up there to where, for instance, Dr. Michael Heiser says Edom is. Then it was roughly 160 miles to 200 miles to feed the sheep. But that makes it a 320 to 400 mile round trip. Is it reasonable to say that Moses would have gone 400 miles or 300 miles, 320 miles to feed his sheep when he lived at an oasis, when he lived at a place that was a lush oasis, or that there was another oasis just 20 miles away? I think that's highly unlikely, highly unlikely. So we're going to give the Edom location an X on this count. Then what about Jebel Sin Bashar? Well, you're talking a 600-plus mile round trip. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's just, there's no way that Moses is going to go on a 600-mile round trip. That's like, why, and just put it in terms of the United States, but except it's desert. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Jebel Sin Bashar clearly gets an X. Har Karkum, again, that's about a 160-mile-plus trip, 320-plus mile round trip. Har Karkum gets an X. The traditional site, and this is what's so interesting, is you'll hear folks like David Roll. They'll say there's no way that the Israelites would have crossed and gone 300 some odd miles all the way down there to Jebel Lawz. But then he's got Moses going on a 450, maybe, by the time that you weave your way through the mountains, maybe a 500-mile round trip just to feed the sheep. And that's no problem. In fact, in his book, he says, I've seen, Iranian shepherds, they go hundreds of miles to feed their sheep, like maybe in Mongolia or something. But, it's not reasonable to say that Moses went all the way up there around the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba and all the way south just to feed the sheep. 400, 500-mile round trip. It really forces us to give the traditional site a big X, okay? What about Jebel Lawz? Well, from Al-Bad, which, by the way, and I didn't mention this, Al-Bad, the other name for Al-Bad in Arabic. The locals call it Muga al-Shu'aib. What does that mean? It means the caves of Jethro. The locals call it Jethro's house. So there's some more, local, and this goes back with Islamic Arab geographers. This goes back 1,000+ years to where they're pointing to Al-Bad as the place where Jethro lived. Okay, so if that's where Moses was, to get to Jabal al-Lawz, it's 16 to 25 miles. You could even say as much as 30 miles, depending on which part of the mountain he was. And then that ends up being about a 30 to 50 mile round trip. Is that reasonable to go feed the sheep? That's still a pretty long hike, but it's reasonable. In fact, Jabal al-Lawz is the only mountain that aligns with the biblical evidence that we have for the location of Midian. And it's reasonable to say, still, 16 to 25 miles on the other side of the desert, that's very reasonable. That's still a pretty far hike. The far side of the desert outside of Al-Bad, when you look at the distance, it's quite a distance. It would qualify as the far side of the desert. You don't have to go hundreds of miles to say the far side of the desert. In fact, to go from Midian to any one of these other locations, you would have had to have gone through multiple deserts. The desert of Zin, the desert of Sin, the desert of Hor, the desert of this, the desert of that. No, it just says the far side of the desert, one desert. So it's general terms, but again, Jabal al-Lawz is the only candidate based on this very important criterion that passes. It's the only one that passes. Okay, now we're going to look at a very interesting criterion, and this is the Exodus March. What is the Exodus March? Well, this is something that Dr. Heiser has brought up, and interestingly enough, he brought it up as an objection to Jabal al-Lawz. Now, I have another whole program where I explain the problem, some of his really big glaring problems with his argument. I recorded that. You can look it up on my YouTube channel. It is a response to Dr. Heiser, and I probably recorded it in March of 2019. I'm not going to rehash all of that now. In fact, what I'm going to do is point out that Dr. Heiser has some very valid points that he makes. The problem is he takes them too far. So let's look at the texts that this argument is derived from. So first of all is Deuteronomy 33, 1 and 2. This is the blessing of Moses, the man of God, who blessed the sons of Israel just before his death. Moses said this, "The Lord comes," or the Lord came from Sinai. So he's coming from Sinai. And he dawned on them from Seir. Now, Seir is well acknowledged to be a chief mountain in the land of Edom. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Mount Paran has a handful of different candidates. We can only work through all of the biblical data and speculate that it's somewhere in between Mount Sinai and Edom, or Mount Sinai and Seir. So he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones, lightning shooting out of his hands. It's this picture of God marching before Israel through the Exodus, and he's shining forth. Now, I argue that this is not just an overly dramatic picture of the Exodus. This is actually the return of Jesus. I'm not going to get into that. Not going to get into that now. But what Dr. Heiser says, and I agree with him fully, is that what the text is doing here is it's using parallelisms. So Sinai, Seir, Mount Paran, these are all parallelisms pointing to the fact that they all share something very similar. It doesn't mean that they're the exact same mountain, but at the very least, they're all within the same region. Now, the question is, what do we mean by the same region? He would want to limit them to a very, very close region, and I would say that this how close is a very subjective matter. I would argue that you can easily demonstrate that Mount Seir and Mount Paran are at least 80 miles apart. And likewise, Mount Sinai is roughly another 90 miles from what is most likely Mount Paran. And I would argue that they're all within the same region of the Exodus route. They're all part of the Exodus march, and they're all part of this picture that's being painted here in passages like this, which is God is shining forth. God, the return of Jesus, but here, the coming of God, it's like the rising of the sun, the shining forth of the sun. And, anybody knows that the shining forth of the sun, it goes in one direction, Light goes in one direction, and it covers a broad area. Likewise, the Exodus march, which this passage is conveying, is a march. March begins one place and ends someplace else. It covers an area, a region. And likewise, I would also argue that all of these places are within the larger region, according to Ezekiel, according to the Bible, again, a different time period, but they're all within the area of Edom. I would argue that Heiser's Edom is probably much too small. So first of all, I agree that they are parallelisms. I just think that he's forcing this very limited, rigid, small location, and he has no real basis to do that. There's nothing here that says they all have to be 5 miles apart or 10 miles apart. I'm not sure how far he would allow for, but he's just trying to do that to say that Jabal al-Lawz is too far outside. But it's not. It's not, again, because Paran is at least 70 miles apart from Seir. So you can't say, well, it's fair to say Paran is 70 miles from Seir, but you can't say that Mount Sinai is 70 or 80 miles. You can't do that. It's inconsistent. The other passage is Judges 5, 1 through 5. This is the Song of Deborah and Barak. Lord, when you went out from Seir, again, very similar language, when you marched from the field of Edom. So now it's using Edom. It throws Edom into the mix. Seir, Edom. And Edom and Mount Seir are used interchangeably oftentimes, again, as parallelisms throughout the Scriptures. It says, the earth quaked, the heaven dripped, even the clouds dripped water, the mountains quaked at the presence of the Lord, even Sinai at the presence of the Lord. So now again it has Edom, Seir, and Sinai, all parallelisms, but does that mean that they all have to be within a 5-mile or 10-mile or even a 50-mile radius? That's the question. Then you have Habakkuk 3, again within this tradition. This is the prayer. So we have the blessing of Moses, the song of Deborah and Barak. Now we have the prayer of Habakkuk. God comes, or God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And then it skips forward toward the end. The same picture is being painted. Again, Teman, Paran. And at the end it says, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress. The tent curtains of Midian were trembling. So what's interesting there is now it pulls in Cushan and Midian. Now Cush, scholars don't know necessarily exactly what's being said here because this is the only place where Cushan is used. But some speculate that it's a variation of Cush. Now again, as I mentioned earlier, Cush would have been over there south of Egypt in Africa, the African continent, but they would have crossed over oftentimes to the southern Arabian Peninsula, Yemen. So if that's the case, if Cush, if Sheba are essentially one and the same, then this is pointing to the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. And then it links in, just like Isaiah 60, Midian. It's pointing to the region of modern-day Saudi Arabia, down there in the Arabian Peninsula. And here, it's tying in Paran and Teman, which again is the same thing, by the way, that Ezekiel and Jeremiah do. They talk about Edom, and they say, I will lay Edom waste, Ezekiel 25, from Teman to Dedan. Dedan is down there, modern-day Al-Ula. That's a couple 100 miles into Saudi Arabia, south of the Jordanian border. So it's pointing to this region, okay? So here's a quote from Dr. Heiser on his Naked Bible podcast. He says, not only do you have Sinai linked to Seir, which I agree, it's linked to Seir, which is this Edomite region south of Canaan, but we have Mount Paran as the place that Yahweh came forth from. Well, he says, I thought it was Sinai. I thought it was Horeb that God came forth from Sinai. He says the answer, well, very well may be, yep, all of these terms could apply to the same place. I don't think he's saying that they are all the same mountain, but he kind of does. He says they could all refer to the same place. I think what he means to say is the same region. Now, critics, of course, want you to split them all up. Well, yeah, it's not just critics. It's, they are separate places. As though they must be different places. They don't have to be different places. In theory, they could be different places. Then you'd have conflicting traditions. I would disagree. You see, again, he's holding to this idea that because they are parallelisms, they must be very, very close. In my previous program, I quoted Eugene Merrill, who says because of the stylized nature of these texts, they don't have to be all extremely close. And I would agree that you have parallelisms, but you have other elements of the text which allow for a much broader region. Again, it's a march. It's a march. Marches, by definition, cover a broad area. They start one place and end someplace else. It's the Exodus march. We know it started in the south at Sinai and it moved forward toward the Promised Land. We also know that based on the nature of the sunrise, it shines forth from one place and it covers a very broad area. So all of the imagery, all of the history, all of the language that's being used in these texts points to a broad area. Okay, so essentially I've just given you a summary of why I think Heiser's being overly rigid. Now here's an interesting verse in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and 2. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan, so he's east of the Jordan, in the desert, in the Arava, opposite Suf. What is Suf? The Yam Suf, the Red Sea. So it says that he was east of the Jordan, east of the continental rift, south of the Dead Sea, and he's opposite, or he's near on the other side of the Red Sea. And then it says between Paran, Mount Paran, and Tophel, and Laban, and Hazeroth, and Dizahab. Now this is an example where you have all these names, and it becomes very complicated. He was in between Paran and someplace else. He was near the Yam Suf. And then it says this, where he was is an 11 days journey from Mount Horeb on the way, the road that goes up toward Mount Seir and Kadesh Barnea. Okay, so Kadesh Barnea is the place that they were at just before they entered the Promised Land. Seir, we are pretty confident, is to the east of the Dead Sea, close to modern-day Petra. Very close to modern-day Petra in southern Jordan. But it says that Mount Horeb, to the place that they were, which was on the road heading up toward Kadesh Barnea and Seir, was an 11-day journey. Now again, let's just go on the small side. Let's say an 11-day journey is 8 or 9 miles, okay? An 11-day journey means that we're dealing with about 100-mile distance from Horeb to where they were near the tip of Suf, near Paran. Even if you move them 20, 30 miles north of Elath, the Gulf of Aqaba, the Red Sea. Let's say you say Moses was 30 miles north. You still have, that's about the perfect distance down to Jebel Allah. This is about, I want to say about 80 miles from the border of Jordan down to Jebel Allah is about 80 miles. So this becomes a huge problem for Dr. Heiser because it says that he was right in between Paran. Paran is about 100 miles from Mount Sinai. Do you see what I'm saying? He's trying to argue that they must all be very close, so close that Jebel Allah is no longer a candidate. But here you have a clear example, biblically, that Mount Paran is probably closer to 100, or even if you said 80, no matter how you want to argue it, it's quite a distance. So when it says the Lord shone forth from Seir, from Sinai, from Mount Paran, we know that Sinai, Paran, and Mount Sinai are all maybe 100 miles difference. So we're dealing with a broad area. Yes, they're all within the same area of the Exodus march, and I would argue that they're all within the area of biblical, at least within Ezekiel's day, Edom, the larger area of Edom, not just this very limited little small version of Edom. Okay, now let's look at the candidates and ask if they fulfill the criteria. So now, if the Lord was shining forth from the area of Edom, does it work? Does it make sense that he was shining up toward Israel? And the answer is yes. So the Edom location gets a check mark. In terms of just this issue, could the Lord come from Edom and shine forth toward Israel? The answer is yes. What about Jebel Sin Bishar? Could he shine from Sinai, if Sinai is Jebel Sin Bishar, over there on the western side of the Sinai Peninsula, over by Egypt, and then shine toward Israel over Edom? No, because the sunrise doesn't take a right angle. In other words, the point is the picture is being painted of the Lord rising from Sinai, just like the Exodus, and his marching forward is like the rising of the sun. It shines over the mountains of Edom, but it's from the vantage point of Israel. It's toward Israel. He's marching toward Israel. And this is just another example of if we take the language, which it's actually some pretty important. Heiser has a very important point. It's some important geographic information within these wilderness traditions, but it completely rules Jebel Sin Bashar out. You have to just throw all those traditions out and ignore them entirely to argue that Jebel Sin Bashar is a candidate. So it gets a huge X on this count. Then, of course, Har Karkum has the same problem. It has to kind of take a right angle. Har Karkum would just be shining straight up into Israel. Why would it have to shine over there to Edom? That really doesn't make sense. The sunrise just doesn't work that way. So again, Har Karkum would unfortunately have to get an X on this count. The traditional site, you could probably argue, you could probably bend that line a little bit and say it's pretty straight. The Lord marches up from the traditional site through Edom. And, because you don't want to be overly anal on this point and say, come on, they weren't that specific with their maps back in those days. It's the general region. I go, okay, that's fair. I'm not going to give it a check or an X. We'll just kind of say it's really neither. It's a little nebulous as to whether or not it passes. Then you have Jebel al-Lawz. Between Edom as that candidate or Jebel al-Lawz, those are the only two that pass with flying colors. In fact, I would argue that Jebel al-Lawz matches the biblical criterion here precisely. The Lord shines forth from Sinai up over Edom, over the mountains of Paran and Seir as he makes his way up toward Zion, from Sinai to Zion. That makes sense. That fulfills, it matches, it aligns with this very important biblical hint concerning geography. So it gets a red check mark. Okay, so with that said, I think we're just going to wrap up this program. Hopefully that was an interesting, kind of a fun little study, just to kind of go through each of the candidates that way, and just, we could probably come up with 10 more hints that are within the Scripture that help us pinpoint the location of Mount Sinai. But we covered a few there. We covered 4 and some pretty interesting points, I think, that will cause everyone to probably think about this a little bit differently. Again, if you have not gotten a copy of my book, Mount Sinai in Arabia, be sure to go to my store. When you get anything on my store, you get a signed copy. This is kind of just the one leg up that I have on Amazon. It benefits the ministry, obviously, when you buy them directly. I have a great warehouse that sends them right out, so it's very fast. So there's Mount Sinai in Arabia, if you want to familiarize yourself with all of these issues, and it's going to become very relevant soon. Again, heading out here in a few weeks, going back to Saudi Arabia, the first Christian tour to the mountain ever. So excited, so grateful and blessed that the Saudi government is opening this up to the world. And over the next few years, we're going to see literally tens of thousands of people are going to go there and get to see it. One of the most faith-stirring events of my life, to be able to visit Mount Sinai. But it blesses the ministry, again, if you buy anything directly through the store. Now, what I've done, and I've mentioned this before, is I've said, let's just go Keith Green style. I've put all of my books, everything, even the books that I just released, I've put them all out available for free as PDF files on my website, joelstrumpet.com. Okay, everything is free as a PDF file. If you want to read, I want everyone to have access to it. And we're trying to put out even a lot of foreign language translations and this sort of thing. So you'll have PDFs in different languages. But there are links there to some of the foreign language translations that are available if they're not free, so that you can actually purchase them. But I just wanted to take that step of faith and just put everything out there, sort of just go kingdom style. That said, I do survive largely based on traveling and speaking, and also monthly support. So if the Lord would lead you to consider becoming a regular supporter, it would bless the ministry, bless me tremendously. So do consider that, prayerfully consider that. Again, keep an eye out for the announcements for the tour to Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. It's going to be an amazing tour. So enough for now. Look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.